So whilst there may be a perception of these distinctions, it's more of a nuanced picture. So next slide, please. So the factors that boaters perceive to influence anchoring and mooring and different boating types include experience level, belonging to a club association, and environmental awareness. So here we go. This is a quote here about perhaps a lot of people not really thinking about seagrass, perhaps sailors are more aware, but this idea that there are people with perhaps little experience and might not know, really not interested. So again, this idea that perhaps education is important. And I think then another issue which quite brought up the complexity of this discussion, really, that the question that, you know, different behaviours might be more or less, it might be linked to different types of trips, whether you're planning to stop at all or not, how long you stop for. And again, this quote here says, well, mixed perceptions really about what level of damage different types of boaters might be doing. So that one talking there saying, I suspect we're all here quite environmentally aware, responsible boaters, and also this mostly anchor in environmental, delightful, delicate places. And the other lot we're talking about go back to the nearest marinas and slipways. Maybe they're doing less damage than the more thoughtful people. So there's some interesting complexity about types of boaters, boating, and perceptions of the type of damage. Okay, next slide, please. But what we did do within the survey, we had the 3 boater types, and we did look at differences between those boater types. There was no difference between the 3 boater types and their intention to avoid seagrass. Everybody was very, felt they would try and avoid seagrass if they knew where it was located. Motor boaters were least likely to say they had ever anchored in seagrass, which perhaps links to the previous point. And of those who had anchored in seagrass, fewer motor boaters were aware that it was there before they anchored in it. Overall, there were few significant differences between the 3 groups across the survey, but a key one was about knowledge about seagrass benefits. Yachter and boaters who used both boats were more likely than the motor boaters to agree that agree with the statements about the environmental benefits of seagrass. So what came out was a slight difference, that motor boaters perhaps had less experience of seagrass and were less knowledgeable about seagrass. Next slide, please. Okay, so this really was about people's approaches to different people's perceptions of the different approaches to changing anchoring mooring behaviours. So I'm going to focus here mainly on advanced mooring systems and also no anchor zones. So there were both positive and questioning views raised towards advanced mooring systems. More information and proof of their effectiveness was asked for, together with questions as to how effective they could be in crowded areas and specific the UK tidal range. I think that comes back to Marie talking about evidence and what works in different places. So two quotes there. One about saying the various issues, another one talking about how they think actually would be quite a good thing. People would like to have to pick up a mooring for a couple of hours rather than anchoring. So some contrasting views there. Okay, next slide. And this was then reflected in the comments from the survey. So we had a free text comment. People could say why or why not they would use an advanced mooring system. And as one said, yes, if it caused less damage, that has to be a good thing. And then others, was an example that having owned moorings had some caused problem, no problems, some caused minor problems. Again, a question about the amount of damage. Now, the majority of the survey respondents said they would use an advanced mooring system over a traditional one if they had the opportunity. And but a substantial minority were unsure, which again, I think is perhaps because this is a new technology. It's not something that there are very many of, not something that people have had a lot of experience of it. Okay, next slide. Okay, and thinking about the sort of no anchor zones or restricted anchoring, again, there were mixed perceptions. People thinking, depending on their location, back to I think what Maria was saying about being context specific, understanding what works in certain places. and a little bit of a concern about, restrictions. Will it be an ever-expanding area? Will it curtail the freedoms that quite a lot of voters really appreciate? And that's one of the key aspects of voting. Next slide, please. There's a feeling that navigational aids could be very useful. An example there of buoys in the Helford area, which say seagrass area, no anchoring, and found that very helpful. And then, as with the evidence review, really saying that combined approaches could be very helpful. And here, quite a nice summary really of the types of things. So encouraging people to think about how they anchor, giving them the information of where perhaps the seagrass is, and then all the other aspects. So this level of sort of enabling people to make good choices and to avoid seagrass where possible. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we use this in looking at barriers and facilitators. We use the COM-B model, so capability, motivation, opportunity. And we'll go to the next slide to talk about capability. So, capability, this is really whether people felt they had the knowledge and skills to to make the changes. There was quite a good knowledge of seagrass in this sample, which contrasts a little bit to some of our evidence, but I think we had a sample of people who were quite aware. But there was a lack of knowledge of where seagrass was locally. So people wanted to know a bit more about it and why they should be protecting it. Not surprisingly, there's varied knowledge and skills of advanced mooring systems. Both people had and had not heard of them. And not surprisingly, not so many people had used them. But people were confident that just about a majority would agree they were confident that they would be able to use one if they had the opportunity. So that's a bit on those knowledge and skills. Next slide, please. So in terms of restricted access voluntary no anchor zones, people said they had heard of it, they knew about them. Confidence was slightly lower than with AMS in terms of confident that they could almost anchor away. I think that comes back to issues around context and places, where would you go if you're going to anchor away? And people saying it would be easy. So a third said they thought it would be easy for them to anchor away. Education and knowledge, again, that's something we keep coming back to, people wanting to have information on why they should make the changes, and also knowing where the seagrass is locally. So those issues around, so that they can avoid it. So issues around knowledge and skills there. Okay, on to opportunity. So people, whether they've got the opportunity. So the lack of information out there. So there's one thing is whether people have the skills themselves. The other with the opportunity is, are there maps? Is there information out there that people can gather to help them make changes? For example, seagrass is not on charts, and so that could be quite a useful thing, so people could actually see where it is. Usefulness, again, of navigational buoys with clear messages, but also making sure that links to a behaviour so people kind of know what to do. Access to necessary infrastructure. So as well, at the moment, there are few advanced mirror systems in place, so not many people have been able to have that experience. People were willing to try them, but safety was an issue. Location differences. Some areas it was easier to anchor away than others. In the survey, for example, more Solent respondents agreed there were plenty of places to anchor away than respondents from Plymouth. Next slide, please. Okay, I might have to just speed up a little bit, just looking at time. Motivation, a finding we found was people in the survey feel connected to the ocean and motivated to protect it. We had an ocean connectedness set of statements that people strongly agreed with, and also were concerned for the environment. There was a willingness to change behaviours that damage seagrass. But there was a bit of resistance, not surprising, to people valuing their freedom. So this tension from an individual desire to go where you want and to be able to do what you want, but also wanting to protect the environment and seeing it as something that's positive to do. Next slide, please. As we said a bit earlier, so people said they would try and avoid seagrass, but some had only, but not so many had looked where it was located, and some had anchored in seagrass. But I think again, those are for not sort of those are for, as we say, sort of opportunity reasons, and also other reasons. An issue of safety, I think, came up very strongly. The main reason for anchoring seagrass, and central to people's decision making, was that it was often possibly a safe place to anchor, and that those concerns will trump decisions over seagrass, and they will always trump things to do with seagrass, was quite a good way of putting it. And just a couple of the other points, so balance and compromise expressed at the boating meetings, that perhaps there could be some restrictions at different times of the year, and having a flexible approach to allow visitors to visit popular locations, and social norms, that they're, where people hear about things. There's interestingly, there was low levels agreements that other boaters anchor away or would use AMS, but people thought people like me would. So that issue of identity, finding out who people identify with, and the importance of the RYA and others to lead, to set an example and to create things becoming a social norm. Okay, I think final slide. I apologise for the trot through the information, but the implications. So what? In thinking through the evidence, come up with a set of things we think that are important to be taken forward to looking at the behaviour change strategy. And I'll just quickly go through them. So recognise that a behaviour change strategy needs to cover the psychological, social, as well as the physical aspects. Builds on this desire of boaters to protect the ocean through developing consistent information about seagrass, the impacts of boaters and actions. Collaborate with boaters on interventions, especially where evidence is perhaps uncertain, where people have questions, and explore